Hello everyone, welcome to Prelims Warm Up. This is an initiative which has been brought to you by Aptiplus Academy for Civil Services. I am Shayak Datta, the Faculty of Geography and Environment at Aptiplus Academy for Civil Services. So in this series, we are bringing to you the important previous year questions which have come from various subjects. In the previous classes, we have discussed certain questions which had come from geography. And in today's class, we'll be looking at some questions which had come from environment. So let us start the class. The first question is from 2011 UPSC prelims paper, and this question is saying biodiversity forms the basis for human existence in the following ways. Biodiversity forms the basis for human existence in the following ways, and they have given four statements. One, soil formation. So the first thing is, does biodiversity help in human existence by helping in soil formation? What do you think? The answer should obviously be yes. So one is correct, right? What about two? Does biodiversity help in human existence by helping to prevent soil erosion? As you can understand, soil is very important for the existence of human beings due to because human beings carry out agriculture cultivation on soil, and if soil erosion takes place, which basically means that the most nutrient rich layer, that is the topsoil, getting eroded or getting removed due to some anthropogenic or natural reason, if that happens, then we'll call it to be soil erosion. So what is soil erosion? It is the removal of the nutrient rich topsoil, that is what is referred to as soil erosion. And if soil erosion takes place, automatically that will result in degradation of the land, which means the fertility of the land will reduce. So that is something which is undesirable. So of course the second statement is also correct. Okay, biodiversity, if it is there, it helps to prevent soil erosion. As you can understand, if there are more number of trees, more amount of green cover, more amount of canopy, automatically that will slow down the rain, and the raindrops will not have so much of effect on the soil. Otherwise, what will happen is, if there's no canopy, then when the rain falls, the raindrops will hit the soil with a much greater speed, and it will have a much greater impact that will help to dislodge soil particles wherever the raindrops hit the surface of the land. So second point is also correct. Third point, recycling of waste. So yes, of course, recycling of waste is very necessary, because without recycling, what would happen? There would be a lot of spread of diseases if you have the dead bodies lying here and there. So it is necessary for waste to be recycled and turned into much less harmful products, which can again be used by plants, by animals, for something else. So biodiversity helps in recycling, as you know. Okay, there are scavengers, etc., and hence that is also something which benefits human beings. And the fourth is pollination of crops. Now obviously you can understand, okay, pollination of crops is very essential, because without pollination, what will happen? Okay, there will not be you cannot have new growth of plants taking place, fruit formation, seed formation, all that will not happen. So pollination is absolutely essential, right? So all the four are important, and as a result of which, for this first question, the correct option should be D, 1, 2, 3 and 4. Okay, so question number 1, answer should be D, 1, 2, 3 and 4. So here I have given you a diagram in which you can see how biodiversity helps us. So please go through the diagram, and you can see, okay, there are so many different uses of biodiversity, and hence it becomes extremely essential for human beings to do everything possible to preserve biodiversity. Okay, so please go through this particular diagram, and you can reproduce the diagram in your mains answer as well. Moving on to the second question for the day. The second question is also from 2011 paper, and this is asking which one of the following is not a site for in situ method of conservation of flora. So whether it is flora or it is fauna, ultimate thing is that, okay, there are two ways in which you can conserve flora and fauna. So it can be either in situ or it can be ex situ. When we say in situ, it means you are trying to preserve that organism in its native environment. You are not taking it out of its native environment. Within its native environment, you are making the conditions suitable so that the organism can thrive over there, it can breed, and it can survive over there. For example, in India, we have so many different type of initiatives by the government in order to conserve India's biodiversity. Say for example, we have Project Tiger, we have Project Elephant. In all these cases, what is done is, It's not like all the tigers and all the elephants, they are taken out from the wild. That is not something what happens. What happens is, under Project Tiger or Project Elephant, we have tiger reserves, we have elephant reserves, and the government tries to provide sufficient amount of protection to tigers and elephants within these areas so that they can multiply, their population can stabilize. It does not essentially mean that these animals, they are taken out from the wild. That does not happen, at least so far as very large animals or top carnivores are concerned. That is not how they are conserved. On the other hand, you can also have another type of method which is called as ex situ method of conservation. So that is usually done when, let's say, if the numbers have fallen very drastically, okay, and there is a high chance of the species going extinct. In that case, the government cannot risk keeping the species outside in its natural environment, because that is where they have been facing the threat of poaching and the threat of extinction. Hence, it becomes very essential to take it out from its natural environment, keep it in an artificial enclosure, but ensuring that the artificial enclosure has all the features of its natural environment and it is well protected over there. So automatically what will happen is, in this artificial enclosure, it will be provided with sufficient amount of food, water, medical care will also be will also be ensured. And this is how what is done is, the numbers of the number of the species, the population of the species is increased in this way. So for example, we have red panda, where we get to see that very successful ex situ conservation captive breeding programs were taken up in the Darjeeling Zoo of West Bengal. Okay, so there are many such species. For example, even the Great Indian Bustard we get to see. For example, the vultures, where captive breeding has been done, and there are many other species as well. Anyway, so here we are dealing with flora, and you have four options: biosphere reserve, botanical garden, national park, wildlife sanctuary. So this question was quite simple, because you can understand that it has to be botanical garden, which is an example of ex situ method of conservation, not an in situ. That is what it is very essential before you go and mark the answer, because you cannot change. Once you have marked in your OMR sheet, you cannot change the answer. So that is why before you mark it, please read the question very carefully. So here it is not asking for in situ method, rather it is asking which is not an in situ method. So out of the given options, you get to see B, botanical garden is not an in situ method because it's an ex situ method. So answer should be B, botanical garden. And here in this flowchart, you can see, okay, what are the various in situ methods of conservation and what are the various ex situ methods of conservation. So you can go through this and try to remember the terms. Okay, say for example, cryopreservation. So you should know here is an example of an ex situ method of conservation. And please go through and just Google on these terms as well. Let's say for example, if you are not aware of what is a biosphere reserve. Now ideally, if you are appearing for this year's prelims, you should be aware of by now. In case if you are not, in that case, please read up on the standard books or just check on the net also what are biosphere reserves. Similarly, you can check for sacred groves. What are sacred groves? These things you should be very well aware of. Okay. So this is with regards to our second question. The third question is again from 2011. So in this session, I have concentrated on the 2011 paper. So consider the following statements. The first statement is biodiversity is normally greater in the lower latitudes as compared to the higher latitudes. Lower latitudes means the areas which are close to the equator and the tropics. So is biodiversity greater over there, near the equator and the tropics, as compared to the higher latitudes? When we say higher latitudes, we are referring to the, let's say, the temperate regions, the polar regions, etc. So obviously, even if you apply logic, then you can understand, yes, that is actually the case. Let's say for example, you take an area like the Amazonian rainforest, which is present at the equatorial area. So that will be having extremely high amount of biodiversity, and compare that to any country which you find in the temperate region. Let's say a country like UK or Finland, something like this. Over there also biodiversity will be present, but definitely not as much as the biodiversity present in the equatorial and the tropical areas. This is what is called as the latitudinal trend of biodiversity. So please go and check what is meant by latitudinal trend of biodiversity. There's a diagram also in NCERT. You can reproduce that in the mains paper if required. So first statement is correct, as you can understand. The second statement, along the mountain gradients, biodiversity is normally greater in the lower altitudes as compared to the higher altitudes. So let's say, for example, there's a mountain. You have a friend who is standing at the foothill of the mountain, and you have another friend who is standing right at the peak of the mountain. So who will be able to see more amount of biodiversity? Let's say greater number of species of trees, animals, etc. Obviously, again, if you just apply logic, you can understand that the person who is standing at the foothills, over there the temperature will comparatively be higher, and higher the temperature, higher the amount of rainfall, automatically the amount of biodiversity will also be higher. So in this case, if we are talking about lower altitudes and higher altitudes, of course lower altitude will be having higher amount of biodiversity. But again, I would just like to point out one more thing. This is what is referred to as altitudinal trend of biodiversity. But I would just like to let you know one more thing. Okay, let's say over here it is asking in general. Okay, in this particular statement, UPSC had asked in general. Okay, it was just trying to find out whether you are aware. Okay, lower areas of the mountains, that is the foothill areas, will have higher biodiversity because of higher temperature, and areas which are present at the peak will have comparatively lower biodiversity. But in, let's say you have a question which is only concentrating on the altitudinal trend of biodiversity, that is how biodiversity changes with the increase of altitude. So if you have a question which solely focuses on the altitudinal trend of biodiversity, then please be very careful and remember this. Okay, it has been observed that the highest amount of biodiversity is actually not found right at the foothills. Okay, highest amount of biodiversity is actually not found right at the foothills, but somewhere in the middle altitudes. So not exactly at the peak, neither exactly at the foothills, but rather somewhere in the middle altitudes of a mountain, a highest amount of biodiversity is usually observed. Now, why that is the case, we still don't know. I mean, there are multiple theories to explain this phenomena, but none of the theories are, foolproof theories. All of them have their drawbacks. So that is why we are not going to go into the theories and why, etc. But for your information, especially when it comes to prelims, where you are just supposed to know facts, know this, that in case there's a mountain and you have three friends, one who is standing at the foothill, one who is standing at the peak, and another friend who is standing somewhere in the middle altitude, then it is seen that the person who is standing in the middle altitude will be able to observe more amount of biodiversity than either of the other two friends. Okay, but anyway, in this particular question it was just asking in general. So yes, both the statements are correct. Answer should be C, both 1 and 2. And over here you can see from the diagram itself, if this is the earth, if this is the equator, then the amount of biodiversity will be higher near the equator, and as you go closer to the poles, that is as you go polewards, the amount of biodiversity will keep on declining. Okay, so that is what is portrayed in this particular diagram. Similarly, in this diagram also आप देख सकते हो, okay, as we go down the hill, amount of biodiversity will be greater. But again, as I told you, this is in general, but usually it has been seen that in the middle altitudes the amount of biodiversity is actually a little bit higher than either the peak or at the very bottom. Okay, so but anyway, this question was asking in general, so remember this. So answer should be C, both 1 and 2. Moving on to the next question. Question number 4, again from 2011, and this question is asking 3 of the following criteria. So you have 5 criteria which have been given, and it is saying that there are 3 criteria out of these 5 which have contributed to the recognition of the Western Ghats, Sri Lanka as well as Indo-Burma regions as hotspots of biodiversity. Out of the given 5 criteria, there are 3 such criteria which have resulted in these areas, that is the Western Ghats, Sri Lanka region and the Indo-Burma region, being declared as hotspots of biodiversity. Which are those criteria? Okay, so first of all, hotspots of biodiversity, from the name itself you can understand, hotspot, or let's say Wi-Fi hotspot, means an area where the Wi-Fi signal will be strong. So similarly, when we are talking about hotspots of biodiversity, there will be a lot of biodiversity present over there. But then again, not all areas which are having high amount of biodiversity can be called as hotspots of biodiversity. There are certain criteria which are mentioned, and these criteria, they have been mentioned by a person, an ecologist whose name is Norman Myers. What are those criteria? We'll see in a while, but before this, just know one thing. Okay, when we are talking about a hotspot of biodiversity, Not only that area should be having very high amount of biodiversity, but apart from that also that area and the vegetation of that area should be threatened because of anthropogenic activities or natural causes. The biodiversity should be very threatened. So one, that area should be having high amount of biodiversity. Two, that biodiversity should be threatened. And three, uh, the biodiversity which is found in that area, it should be endemic to that area. What do we understand the term endemic? Endemic means the biodiversity should only be found in that area and nowhere else. Automatically, if an area is very rich in biodiversity and the biodiversity or the species, they are found only in that area, plus you also have a threat factor working over there, then it becomes very, very important to conserve such areas, to protect such areas from destruction. Hence, we get to see a particular worldwide NGO whose name is Conservation International. So they give the designation of a biodiversity hotspot. But the criteria is given by an ecologist whose name is Norman Myers. Now, let's see which are the criteria. Number one, species richness. So as I've told you that yes, you require high number of species to be present in an area for that area to be termed as a biodiversity hotspot. So yes, definitely species richness. Vegetation density. No, vegetation density is not exactly an important criteria as per what Norman Myers has said. Endemism is very important. As I told you, okay, those species, they need to be endemic to that area. They should not be found anywhere else. So endemism is a criteria. Fourth, ethnobotanical importance. No, that is not so much important as mentioned by Norman Myers. But threat perception should be there. There should be an imminent threat to that area, as a result of which it is important for us to conserve that area, to protect that area. So 1, 3 and 5 should be the right answer. And C, yes, answer should be C. And here I have given you the various biodiversity hotspots which are there. You can update, I mean, this is not an updated information because as you can see, this particular diagram was published in the year 2005 and the number of biodiversity hotspots have increased since then. So I would just recommend that you can go to the website of Conservation International. That is the NGO, or that is the organization which announces biodiversity hotspots. So you can go to their website and you can check the latest list of biodiversity hotspots which are there and how many there are. Okay, so this is with regards to biodiversity hotspots. Moving on to the last question for the day, again from 2011, we get to see, okay, there is a concern over the increase in harmful algal blooms in the sea waters of India. So they have asked you, okay, what can be the causative factors for this phenomenon? There is a concern over the increase in harmful algal bloom. So algal bloom is basically a phenomena where we get to see that the population of algae, okay, the population of algae, that is the population of phytoplanktons, they will increase and they will increase very, very rapidly, to this extent that it is possible that there will be discoloration of the water, though it is not always necessary, but there can be discoloration of the water. And it is also possible that the oxygen level, or the level of oxygen which is dissolved in the water, that can also start to fall, and as a result of which it can result in a lot of death of aquatic organisms. It can also lead to some amount of local air pollution taking place. When such a phenomena takes place, we call it to be harmful algal bloom, or HAB. The thing is, algal blooms, usually they are not harmful, but sometimes it is possible that because of let's say some dead organism getting decomposed in an anaerobic environment, some kind of toxins can get released which can result in further death of more aquatic species. Okay, so in that case it might be possible that the water might become a little toxic. Then we call it to be a harmful algal bloom. Sometimes it is also possible that wherever harmful algal bloom has taken place, due to the abundance of these phytoplanktons, the color of the water might change into a reddish one. So it might become reddish brown. In that case, the phenomena is called as red tide. The phenomena is referred to as red tide. So harmful algal bloom, it is sometimes also referred to as red tide, but not always. So it is not necessary that, so that this term red tide, it is actually a misnomer. Misnomer means that the term is not actually given properly. It is not necessary that for an algal bloom to be harmful, the color has to turn red. It is not necessary. It can still be greenish or bluish, and still it can be, or it can not have any color as also, but फिर भी it is possible that the water might be carrying toxins. So anyway, what are the causes? Number one, discharge of nutrients from the estuaries. Yes, discharge of nutrients, that is enrichment of the water by nutrients. This is what is referred to as eutrophication. This is what is referred to as eutrophication. So yes, that is possible. Runoff from the land during monsoon. So when there is a lot of rainfall, what will happen? All this rainwater will wash away the nutrients, the fertilizers which have been applied in the agricultural fields, and all these fertilizers will ultimately drain off into the nearby water source, ultimately resulting in eutrophication taking place. And whenever eutrophication will take place, automatically that will result into algal bloom. So second statement is also correct. Third statement, upwelling in the sea. I think in one of the previous classes we had mentioned that upwelling basically means when the nutrient rich water which is found in the lower parts of the sea and the ocean, they come up to the top, helping in the replenishment of nutrients in the surface water. That is what is called as upwelling. Okay, upwelling is basically the colder nutrient rich water from the lower parts of the oceans and seas coming out to the top. So again, there are some related topics in physical geography, oceanography part, where you have something called as Ekman layer, Ekman spiral, Ekman transport. So please go through these terms. What is Ekman layer, Ekman spiral, Ekman transport? And it is the Ekman transport, Ekman spiral which is related to this entire phenomenon of upwelling. So yes, all the three are responsible for the formation of harmful algal blooms, and D should be the right answer. 1, 2 and 3. So this is how it looks like sometimes when you have a harmful algal bloom and you have a red tide phenomenon. Again, the water near the coast will turn reddish in color. So with this we complete today's session. We have discussed 5 questions from environment, and I will join you again in another session. Till then, stay safe, study hard, and thank you so much.
I'm an icon, man. And my girl about a 10. I should fuck her in the Benz.